the pension illusion, and the Salzwedel moments. Salzwedel doesn't provide a high-gloss backdrop this evening, but rather a reality check with an announcement. The Chancellor is on stage, trying to turn a clear mood in the room into a small misunderstanding. The question is simple. The audience is visibly unambiguous, and yet it's acted as if the last three naysayers still need to be brought out of a backroom before one can even speak of a majority. Exactly this pattern is the core of the problem. If the political outcome doesn't fit, it's not read as a signal, but as a disturbance in the broadcast schedule. This is not leadership. This is damage control with a tie. The scene begins with the usual packaging, as if it were about a fair balance between groups supposedly in the same boat. Self-employed individuals and civil servants, vigorously stirred, then kindly served as a major question of justice. Sounds clean, sounds social, sounds like sensible reform. But it isn't. Self-employed individuals bear their own risk, build something up, pay from their own efforts, and if the month goes badly, there is no automatism that catches them. Civil servants are part of a system based on security, hierarchy, and alimony logic. Simply equating both is convenient for talk shows and deadly for any honest debate. Then comes the moment that exposes everything. The cards in the audience clearly point in one direction, but instead of acknowledging the signal, a slow-motion, evasive maneuver follows. Yes, there are also some with no, as if democracy were a search game where one pokes around the edges until the majority suddenly becomes blurred again. Exactly this talk makes people angry because it insults their perception. Everyone sees what is happening, but on stage, it's spoken as if we just had a complicated calculation result that a commission first needs to calmly examine. And because evasion alone isn't enough, the next safety net immediately appears. The basic law as a rhetorical emergency exit. One cannot override it. One has taken an oath. One will, of course, remain within the framework. This sounds serious as long as no one asks questions, because the framework in this country's history has been changed, supplemented, rebuilt, and readjusted again and again. Not out of caprice, but because politics always claims it must react to new situations. So anyone who speaks today as if every change to the system is a sacrilege is not selling constitutional loyalty, but rather convenience in lofty words. Precisely here, the mood noticeably shifts. An interjection hits the nail on the head in one sentence. The dignity of man is inviolable. Little more needs to be said about this, because this sentence acts like a mirror. It confronts the political staging with what it constantly claims to protect, but in everyday life increasingly buries under budget logic. When people work, pay, make sacrifices, and still live with growing insecurity, the question is not whether a studio format remains calm. The question is whether the state can still explain its priorities without resorting to excuses. At its core is a pension system that appears less credible with every political cosmetic adjustment. The calculation is brutally simple, even if hidden behind formulas and paragraphs. More recipients, fewer supporting shoulders. Add to that a labor market creaking under deindustrialization. Anyone who, in such a situation, only forces new groups into the system repairs nothing, but rather prolongs the collapse over several stages. It's like a bottomless pit where every new pipeline is celebrated as a reform, even though everything continues to flow through at the bottom. Now, including the self-employed, is labeled as solidarity, but for many, it feels like a penalty fee on initiative. First, entrepreneurial spirit is praised in Sunday speeches, then in everyday life, it's treated like a draining reserve fund. Anyone who builds their own business already knows risk, uncertainty, and overtime without applause. If precisely this group is then designated as the next stopgap for a dilapidated model, one should not be surprised at the loss of trust. In parallel, the same principle applies to statutory health insurance. Officially, it's called protection and community. In practice, it often feels like a system with an escape hatch whose handle is mounted higher each year. Switching to private insurance remains formally possible for many, but realistically unattainable. This is not how you build acceptance, but dependence. And dependence is then sold as stability. That may be communicatively clever, but it's politically short-sighted because it only builds up resentment. The sharpest punchline this evening is therefore not an interjection, but the matter-of-factness with which the audience is talked past, as if people were merely extras who are expected to applaud at the end, no matter what was said before. But that time is over. Those who listen today compare statements with real life, with bills, with job opportunities, with what is currently breaking down in their own environment. And if a clear no to the old narrative emerges from this, then that is not an operational accident, but a political judgment. The real scandal, therefore, is not that someone asks an inconvenient question. The scandal lies in how routinely it is responded to. First, minimizing, then referring to procedures, then jumping to the next slide. This choreography has become so deeply ingrained that it is almost considered normal. Yet, it is the direct path to alienation between the governed and the government. Anyone who merely smooths the tone instead of resolving the conflict ultimately produces not calm, but creeping contempt on both sides. The fact that the group of self-employed individuals is precisely the one to serve as the answer is symbolically revealing. It stands for personal responsibility, for initiative, for the willingness to dare something without a safety net. When the state first reaches into this group during a crisis, it sends a clear signal. Courage is praised as long as the coffers are full and burdened as soon as the balance sheet tilts. This double message dismantles trust faster than any opposition speech because it is immediately tangible in everyday life. At the same time, pressure on the labor market is increasing. When industrial substance disappears, not only jobs disappear, but also prospects for entire regions. Then every additional mandatory contribution becomes a question of bare feasibility, and politics cannot ignore this connection forever and pretend that a structural problem can be covered up with new contribution obligations. Anyone who tries that manages scarcity instead of building a future. And precisely in such a situation, what is needed is not moderators' phrases that polish harmony, but plain talk about priorities. Which expenses are indispensable? Which promises were illusions? Which structures truly need to be reformed, even if it gets uncomfortable? Instead, we too often experience a communication model that treats conflicts like stains. Quickly cover them up, dim the lights, keep talking. But every covered stain grows larger if no one cleans it. The scene with the interjection sticks in the mind because it reveals the relationship between the stage and the room in a few seconds. Up there, the reflexive reference to rules. Down here, the reminder of dignity and reality. Up there, the fear of losing control. Down here, the frustration with controlled answers. It's not about volume, it's about credibility. And credibility doesn't arise from perfect formulations, but from the willingness not to moderate away uncomfortable truths. Nobody demands magic, but people expect problems to be called by their names and not disappear behind legal platitudes. If the pension system in its current form is not sustainable, then that must be clearly stated. Yes, if the financing doesn't add up, then structural corrections are needed instead of ever new forced integrations. If political majorities block changes, then one must not stage that as a law of nature, but must name the responsibility. The Salzwedel moment therefore shows more than a failed appearance. It shows the rift in the political self-image. There is a class that considers itself pragmatic, but often only acts reactively. It calls this stability when it conserves old structures, even though these are visibly eroding. It calls it responsibility when it distributes burdens without consistently tackling the root causes. And it calls it dialogue when critical voices are tolerated just long enough until they disrupt the flow. Anyone who criticizes this mechanic is not extreme, but observant. Anyone who gets upset about evasive answers is not irrational, but empowered. Anyone who insists on dignity, while ever new obligations meet increasingly meager realities of life, defends the core of what this country once agreed upon. Precisely why it's not about new buzzwords now, but about a political style that no longer treats people like an audience, but like sovereigns. The task is clear. End the illusion that an overstretched system can be saved by new mandatory payers. End the reflexive reference to unchangeability when change is politically inconvenient. End debates where the most honest statements come from the audience and the weakest from the stage. Brief interruption. You're about to see news again that shows how unstable everything has become. Banks, energy, politics, pressure everywhere, and most don't even realize how vulnerable they are. If you don't want to be among them, then click the link below this video. The crisis preparedness system makes you invulnerable legally, financially, and digitally. Whoever wants trust back must first stop disguising the obvious. And to all who are fed up with this situation, stay loud, stay precise, stay inconvenient. Not for uproar, but for clarity. Not for tribal thinking, but for responsibility. Not for applause on command, but for politics that once again speaks with reality. Share this video.